We are live in 3, 2, 1. So we are live. Please start.
Good evening, friends. Welcome to the Thursday evening webinar series of the CSI Delhi branch, the PG track program that we have been running successfully for almost a year now. Today, in the 41st webinar, we'll be talking about the clinical approach to pulmonary arterial hypertension step by step. And as you all know, before we start the webinar, I would like to bring forth a couple of points in front of you that in case you have missed any of the webinars, they are available on our YouTube channel of PG Track CSI Delhi branch. And also, we have uploaded all the webinars happened till date on our CSI Delhi branch website also. You can visit, directly click all the promos, and all these webinars are directly available. You can listen to them, you can download, and you can keep them for your own as a treasure, because we are getting the best of these speakers across the country only for you. And in case you have any questions, clarifications, or any particular topic to be taken, we would be very happy that you please write to us on our email, or you can personally message in all the WhatsApp groups that we are running. So today in this journey, we have the pleasure of having our star speaker, Dr. Ramakrishnan. It's always a pleasure to have Dr. Rama back on our PG track. He has been one of the backbones of this program and has been a great supporter, both by taking the lectures and by suggesting and drafting this program very beautifully. Along with me on this journey, I have my colleagues, Professor Sumod Kurian, Professor Girish MP, and Dr. Neeraj Avasthi. So before starting, Sumod, I would like you to please welcome Dr. Rama and start the session.
Once again, a very warm welcome to today's PG Track program. We had a beautiful session by Professor Narayan last week, and Dr. Narayan was referring to Dr. Ramakrishnan as one of the leading figures in the field of pediatric cardiology, whom we are all looking up to in this time. And today, Dr. Rama is here with us to speak to us about how to evaluate a patient with pulmonary arterial hypertension in a stepwise manner. Dr. Rama is the professor of cardiology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, an excellent teacher. Give sir any subject, he will teach it so beautifully. So we are all so eager to listen from Dr. Rama this evening. Welcome, sir. Please come and teach us on the stepwise evaluation of PAH.
Thank you, Dr. Mohit, Girish, and thanks a lot, Dr. Sumod, for such a nice introduction. I think my topic is going to be how to approach a patient with pulmonary hypertension, kind of a stepwise approach, basically focusing more on clinical. So first and foremost question is so how is the DM examination different from an MBBS or an MD exam? Because the cases remain the same. For example, you are likely to get a tetralogy. In MBBS also, you could have got a tetralogy, or an MD exam, definitely you could have got a patient with PAH or a tetralogy. So how is it different? So I think, in my opinion, I think the major differences is in your understanding of the hemodynamics and in understanding the natural history of the disease. And you are expected to know a bit more of physiology, and with that physiological understanding, you should be able to better understand the signs that are present in the patient. So that is how the DM examination is different. Otherwise, the same dyspnea classification remain, the same heart failure remain, everything is the same. So first and foremost, let us concentrate a few things on hemodynamics that all of you must know. Like many of you may be knowing all this, I am going to tell, but these are something that all of you must know before you appear for an examination. Before that, pH is just another term. It's like fever. Somebody is having fever. Same thing. It's an observation. By itself, is not a diagnosis. So you should know what is a normal PA pressure. It is roughly around 14. Normally, PA pressure can increase up to 30 mm/Hg. This is a normal PVRI. A normal RV can generate easily without failing around 50 to 60 mm/Hg. And in chronic stage, if it is overload is gradually building up, it can still generate much more before it starts to fail. If you take away the one lung, or if you take even occlude one PA branch, no pressure changes happen. And you should be aware of what are the vasoconstrictors and vasodilators of a pulmonary circuit. So this is something that all of you must be aware of. So this is the older definition that was there. So we used to have pulmonary hypertension. and you have differentiated into pre-capillary and post-capillary. And then among the post-capillary, it can be an isolated post-capillary hypertension, or it can be a combined post-capillary and pre-capillary hypertension. So the earlier definition used to have a cutoff of exercise cutoff of 30 and a PA mean pressure of greater than 25. But we realized, as I told you in the last slide, the normal PA is roughly around in the range of 14 plus minus, and very rarely, almost never goes above 20 in a normal healthy individual. So the pH definition has totally changed to around 20 mmHg. So that is present in all these subgroups. So how do you differentiate between pre-capillary and post-capillary hypertension? So pre-capillary hypertension is defined as PA wedge pressure of less than 15, and they have now added a cutoff of PVRI of greater than 3 Wood unit. This is added specifically because there is a small subset of people, especially in infants and small children, where there is a large amount of flow. The PA mean pressure is higher than the definition, and the wedge pressure is lower than the definition, and the PVRI is there. But there mostly it is all hyperkinetic pH, and the PVRI is less than 3. There also this can happen actually. So then this is a small definition that has been given. So the PVRI has been added here. So this is classical, that pH, IPH that we think of, the pH due to lung disease, chronic thromboembolic pH, and pH with unclear or multifactorial mechanism are there in both groups. So coming to the post-capillary hypertension, this is very simple. Don't confuse the terms. Is PVH contributing to pH or not? If PVH is contributing to pH, this is happening beyond the capillaries. This is in the venous system. It is a post-capillary hypertension. So don't confuse terms. It's very simple. So it is absolutely simple. So then how do you differentiate between the different things? You will discuss whether it is an isolated post-capillary pH or it's a combined post-capillary and pre-capillary pH. We'll discuss further. How do you differentiate? One of the key term that you should understand is what is known as a transpulmonary gradient and a diastolic pulmonary gradient. These two terms, all the DM students who are appearing for exam should be well aware of. A transpulmonary gradient is very simple. It's a mean PA pressure minus the mean pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So in effect, what is actually the flowing pressure? You take away the flowing pressure that is driving the circuit, and what is actually happening there? What is this reactive pH? So this is what is being there. So normally it is around less than 12 mmHg. So if it is a transpulmonary gradient, that is the mean PA pressure is higher than, at least 12 mm higher than the mean pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, then you think there is an element of vasoconstriction or element of vasospasm or element of vasoproliferation is there, which is typical of a reactive pH. Am I clear here? So if this is PVH is leading to pH. So in this subset, you are looking at the transpulmonary gradient. If the transpulmonary gradient is within this 12 mmHg, then it's just the flow related ones. But if it is more than that, there is an element of reactive component to this pH. So still it is not a very good definition. Then this classification came up, that is the use of diastolic pressure gradient. So this is a simple tree that gives away this concept, that is pulmonary pressure is there, that is pulmonary hypertension is there. The mean capillary wedge pressure is, if it is lower, it is a pre-capillary hypertension, or at times it can be a hyperkinetic pH can be there. If it is greater than 15, this is the group that we call it as a post-capillary pH. Then first thing that you look at is the transpulmonary gradient. If it is greater than 12, there is an out of proportion or a reactive component to the pH. So there is a kind of a thing is there. And if it is less than that, this is a passive pH. Then you look at the diastolic pressure gradient. Diastolic pressure gradient, the cutoff is 5 or 7. The total pressure gradient cutoff around 12 or 15. So these numbers you should remember. So then if it is greater than 7, the diastolic pressure gradient is greater than 7, then or greater than 5 in some other things, it is considered there is a pulmonary vascular disease is superimposed on left-sided pressure elevation. So there is a component of, say, vasoconstriction, vasoproliferation, that is in addition to the pulmonary venous hypertension that is happening there in the left side. So this is a very key concept that you should all be very clear, no confusion. It should be very clear. So another important thing that you should consider is that there can be another reason, like there can be sometimes hypotension or can be there, or that times it can be a HPF that is producing all this. This is the same thing in a different fashion. But most important use of this slide is the diastolic pressure gradient of greater than 20 generally is an indication for a prostacyclin treatment. It's very likely to be effective. So these are some of the reasons why most of the pulmonary vasodilators don't work in left-sided pulmonary hypertension. Like for example, in mitral stenosis, where the data is not there, and most of the HPF situation, generally the pulmonary vasodilator therapies don't work. So for a clinician, the understanding this is very important, because based on this, you can decide whether to start a patient, whether to initiate a patient on pulmonary vasodilator therapy or not. So it's very simple. So less than 7 is isolated post. If, for example, if the wedge pressure is greater than 12, it is clearly the wedge pressure is higher and it is contributing to the pulmonary hypertension. If the diastolic pressure gradient is less than 7, it's the isolated post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. This is a spastic hydrostatic pulmonary pressure elevation. Whereas if it is greater than 7, it indicates it's a combined pre and post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. If the pressure is low, the diastolic pressure gradient is less than 7, then you think of a systemic hypotension or a HPF. You can consider fluid challenge and other things. Or if it is greater than 7, it's a pre-capillary hypertension. So this is a very important hemodynamic understanding that you should have. So this is again given in the other fashion. Like. So now we go to the clinical classification. This, I think, another thing that is often asked, and you should be aware of all these things, where I think minor alterations have been done. So mostly it is pulmonary arterial hypertension, idiopathic, heritable, drug and toxin, and associated with connective tissue, HIV infection, portal hypertension, and congenital heart disease, and schistosomiasis, all are grouped here. Whereas one dash is a pulmonary veno-occlusive disease and pulmonary capillary hemangiomatosis. One double dash is actually the persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn, that is PPHN. So all of them are like considered kind of a PH, and in most of these situations, the pulmonary vasodilators do work. The next important group is the pulmonary hypertension due to the left heart disease, systolic dysfunction, diastolic dysfunction, valvular heart disease, and other left-sided lesions. Then you have the lung disease, where most of the time it's a hypoxia that is cause of the problem. Then you have the CTPH, and then you have a multifactorial or unclear etiologies, like mainly the hematological disorders, the renal disease, and so on, which are the more common ones that you find. So coming to the practical things, now we have discussed something about the hemodynamics. Now we go to what are the pH cases that you are likely to encounter in the exams. Even though there is so many classification is there are so many groups are there. In essence, if you are given a case of pH, these are the 3 likely possibilities. And Eisenmenger syndrome is very likely, or you are likely to get an IPH as a third case, which could be a kind of a CTPH patient. That is, these are the 3 possibilities. And always remember, silent MS in our parts of the country will always remain a differential diagnosis for patient who was presenting with severe pH only. So in nutshell, you are unlikely to be given any case other than these 4 cases. Let us keep it very simple. So our primary problem is going to be differentiating between all these cases. That's all. If you're suspecting pH, in the exam, even though there is a plethora of causes are listed, you are unlikely to be kept any other case apart from these cases in your exam. So let us keep it very simple. So when do you generally suspect IPH is dyspnea? I think most importantly, you should all know you should use WHO functional classification when you report, when you're dealing with a case of pulmonary hypertension. And oftentimes you don't find left-sided features. Syncope could be there, and then there could be chest pain, and there is right heart failure, and there can be cyanosis in some of them. These are the various things. And this is the distribution of symptoms in idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. So most often, idiopathic pulmonary hypertension presents with dyspnea. So it's almost more around 80%. Very rarely it can present with syncope, and heart failure is pretty rare. But in some of the registries, heart failure can be up. It all depends from where you are getting the registry. If you get the registry from, say, tertiary care centers, then you get roughly around 20% of patients presenting with heart failure. Our proportion of patients presenting with heart failure is slightly more because we often diagnose pulmonary hypertension pretty late. So coming to Eisenmenger syndrome, how do they present commonly? There can be history of symptoms suggestive of left to right shunt in infancy. patients can have cyanosis, erythrocytosis, and headache, where they can actually, you can confuse it with tetralogy more than confusing with idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. And most of them, vast majority of them will be mildly symptomatic with dyspnea and fatigue are the most common features. Rarely they can have syncope, CVA, or hemoptysis, or some of the other complications of cyanosis that can be associated with this problem. So a simplified understanding of Eisenmenger syndrome will be, you can actually convert them into three groups. When in an Eisenmenger syndrome, you see in an adulthood, commonly you were given a case of 25-year-old or 20-year-old Eisenmenger syndrome in the exam. So there are three basic groups in which you can combine Eisenmenger syndrome. So all of you think that second thing, that is a failure to thrive in infancy, and then there is a subtle phase, and then the symptomatic adolescent will be the most common. Yes, this is the most common thing, but a vast majority of them can have an insidious presentation also. That what I mean is, there is no future of increased flow in the early childhood, and they just insidiously present with new onset of cyanosis and symptoms in their second decade of life, and they are diagnosed to have Eisenmenger syndrome. The first group that I've written is a very common group in early childhood, but generally the survival into late adulthood or adolescence and late adulthood is not very common. So generally that is found in mostly children. So that is cyanosis since birth, and they continue to become Eisenmenger syndrome. That is mostly the CCHT with increased QP group. That is CCHT with increased blood flow group. Include like your truncus arteriosus, TGA, your DURE with VSD-PH, tricuspid atresia with VSD with PH, all those conditions where there is a VSD with PH kind of a situation. Even rarely, I think TAPVC can become Eisenmenger also. So all these VSD with PH, complicated VSDs, CCTGA with VSD-PH, all of them can become large VSD. If it is large, they generally become Eisenmenger pretty early. So some of them will continue to have cyanosis. For example, TGA VSD-PH will be born with cyanosis, and the cyanosis will worsen and they become Eisenmenger syndrome. The process starts very early in them. So this is a group that we don't find in adulthood commonly. Maybe there will be an exceptional survival, like for example, in a large series that we were maintaining, maybe around 200 patients with Eisenmenger syndrome, we have roughly around 10 to 15 patients with cyanosis with increased QP Eisenmenger surviving into 20 years of age. Average age in our series was roughly around 25 years of age. So this second group is very common, but third group is also equally around 30% of patients come with insidious presentation. That means there is no increased QP signs. So how do you explain that? Why should a large VSD remain asymptomatic in that particular patient? One of the explanation could be something called persistent pulmonary fetal circulation. That means their PVRA has never regressed because of the large VSD. Their PVRA never regressed. They remained like with a high PVRA. So within few months, there is never a increased flow situation in them. So this could be one of the explanation why such a thing happened. Or many times it happens that patient would have had this and patients could not recollect the symptoms, or the parent would not recollect the symptom, or they think this is usual for the patient. So these are the two explanations that can explain this presentation. Coming to the other important differential diagnosis is CT-PH in a patient. So one common question that everybody should know is, how often a patient of CT-PH will give you a history of pulmonary embolism? And the other way around is, how often a patient of pulmonary embolism will develop CT-PH? So the first graph shows the percentage is not very high. The percentage is only 3.8. It's a very, very classic number. I think this is number that you should know. So the question is, if you have a pulmonary embolism today, so what are your chances of developing into CT-PH with treatment, without treatment, whatever you have? So natural history suggests that it is roughly around only 3.8% at 2 years. And then there is a plateau that happens. It's a fantastic study. I think this is quoted everywhere. So the incidence is roughly around 1% at 6 months, and then there is a 3.1% at 1 year and 3.8% at 2 years. A very classical finding that happens, very classical course that happens in these patients is, the other question, before I come to that classical course that happens, the other question is, how often a patient who is diagnosed with CT-PH, say around 20 years, 30 years in your exam, who is kept in the exam as a PH case, so how often they will give you a history of DVT or pulmonary embolism? So not always. So quite often there is an insidious presentation, maybe around 30 to 50% of cases. They don't give a history of previous DVT or pulmonary embolism. They just have come to you with PH. So that is the other important thing. So what is the course? If somebody develops pulmonary embolism, what is the course to somebody developing CTPH? A very classical term is there is a honeymoon period. So they get a pulmonary embolism, they are symptomatic, they get treatment and they become better. And there is a big phase of, say, roughly around 3 to 6 months before they start developing CTPH-like symptoms. So there is a big honeymoon period, which is almost always observed. So you see this graph also. Very rarely patients develop CTPH-like picture with immediately following a pulmonary embolism. So what are the important things to understand and differentiate is, like, for example, if a patient comes to you with some thrombotic events in the pulmonary artery and you have done a CT, the management is totally different. The surgical management is totally different. In one case, you are going to do an embolectomy if it is an acute event, and the other case, you are going to do an endarterectomy, which is a bigger surgery. These are two different things. Nowadays, with imaging, we can try to differentiate, but often this distinction may not be very easy and clear. What is the natural history like? Natural history, CTPH is again a deadly disease, especially if the pH, especially where we see clinical heart failure, where we see the pH is pretty bad. So actually, if you look at 3 years survival, it is less than 50%. In symptomatic with pulmonary hypertension, significant pulmonary hypertension, CTPH is a deadly disease, like almost worse than an IPH. That is something that you should remember. Without treatment, without surgery, it is again another deadly disease. So the course is one thing that is helping to differentiate. So how do you differentiate? These are the three major things that I have told the natural history, a bit of natural history in all of them. So, so how do you differentiate? The most important differentiating feature in among all of them is how is the onset and how is the course of the disease? How is the symptom onset and how is it progressing? That is a very, very key thing where you have to spend more time in eliciting the onset of dyspnea, how it started, how it is progressing, how is it coursing, when right heart failure developed, when syncope developed in the course of illness. All those things are very, very important in differentiating. So in nutshell, generally, IPH should be a recent onset, say around maximum of around 3 years. It is generally rapidly progressive, and long survival is unlikely except in very rare instances of CCB responsive patients. But most of us are starting to see a bit more prolonged survival in some of our patients with IPH with the advent of various pulmonary vasodilator therapies. CTPH can have a stuttering course, can have a pleuritic pain, can have dyspnea, can have a history of DVT and thrombosis, but may not have any of them. They can present with same insidious onset progressive dyspnea also. One of the important things that you should understand is this graph. There is any cause of pH, irrespective of the etiology of pH, whatever be the cause of pH begets pH like. So generally it is progressive. Generally the PVR keeps on increasing. Then the exercise cardiac output starts falling. Then the pulmonary artery pressures keeps on increasing, and then cardiac output starts to fall from one particular thing. Then everything goes downhill. From this phase, even today, the mortality is very high. Once you have a very high PVR, reduced cardiac output, and exercise cardiac output is declining, and PA pressure is in the high range. So this is something that you should all remember. It doesn't follow one graph, one course, one clear line. It's a one particular point where there's a rapid downhill course. Another important thing that you should understand is that the way PH patients respond or the increase in mean arterial pressure correlates with cardiac output changes is very variable compared to a normal person. So for example, in this graph suggests that, for example, we can increase our cardiac output, say from 5 liters to double it at very little increase in PA pressure. So most of us will not have, suppose we exercise, heavy exercise, get our cardiac output from 5 liter to 10 liter. So we can immediately achieve it without much increase in PA pressure. PA pressure will go from 14 to 20 max. It doesn't cross more than 20, but this is extremely unrealistic changes in patients with PH. That is something. That is why they suffer a lot with exertion. So I want to do about natural history, some of the three common notions that we all had. Everybody is taught is Eisenmenger syndrome survival is much better than IPH. This is a classic graph that goes around in all these lectures. Like for example, Eisenmenger syndrome, the survival is a lot better in over long time compared to IPH. Another thing is that IPH has worse prognosis than CHD-PH, CTD-PH has further worse prognosis, and HIV-induced PH is further worse prognosis. But this may remain true. And very, very bleak survival that was reported by the NH registry data, say around even class 1, class 2 patients, average survival, median survival was roughly around 5 months. For 60 months, that is roughly around 5 years, and then roughly around 2.5 years for class 3 and half a year for class 4. This has been the conventionally what is happening. But some of the recent data that initially came shocked the people who are working in pulmonary hypertension. They suggested that the IPH survival was better than CTD-PH. Surely CTD. CTD-PH was almost similar to IPH, and the other PVOD was really worse. Portal pulmonary hypertension was worse. And another important thing is how the prognosis has changed. I think when you are preparing for your exam, one thing that I should recommend you to read is the REVEAL registry, because it's a contemporary registry which has given a lot of information. So clearly from the NIH time, the French registry suggested we are improving, and then the REVEAL registry suggested we have further improved with a nearly 5-year survival touching around 60%. So this is something that you should know. That is because one of the reasons could be that these registries now, the PH is diagnosed earlier and earlier. We are diagnosing more of the patients in the symptomatic and stable phase than the progressive declining phase, where most of the patients in NH registry were. That could be one of the reasons why the survival is improving. Whether adjusted survival is improving or not, we are not very sure. One of the important change that is happening in the world literature is survival syndrome. The survival of Eisenmenger syndrome, this is a very large study. This is another thing that you should all read. Many of you come prepared with Paul Wood series, but when we ask about some of the newer things development in Eisenmenger syndrome, most of you don't know. I don't think anywhere else in cardiology or medicine will be asking something that is published way back in the 1950s and 60s. So, but this is something Paul Wood series is going on and on. But you should be, no, I don't have a problem in knowing that, but I think you should be knowing some of the large registries of Eisenmenger syndrome. These registries, roughly around 1,100 patients across the world, major centers participated, where the median follow-up of 3 years, 25% died. And there are 6 transplants, 3 years. And then 5-year survival extrapolated is nearly accounting the same. They are like the same. So why this is happening? Some of the explanation is are because of tertiary care center bias. Most of these centers were tertiary care, where they will be more sicker Eisenmenger syndrome would be enrolled. There is an immortal time bias. This is something that I think you should all utter this word in the exam and understand what it is. Why Eisenmenger syndrome is not as good as now we know that possibly most of the registries, the REVEAL registry also revealed the same. And this large study is also suggesting the same. And there is a big cohort of Sweden or Switzerland. There's a big natural population-based study has come that also suggests that Eisenmenger survival is as good as IPH only. So there is something called immortal time bias. That means what it means is that the patient has to live longer enough to come into this group of studies from tertiary care center. For example, the patient has to reach means 20 years. A lot of people would have died, and these are the ones who were naturally selected. If you start them from day one, all of them, the Eisenmenger syndrome survival will be very bad. So this is called immortal time bias. But clearly, Eisenmenger syndrome is not a benign disease. And in this study, they clearly suggested that pre-tricuspid shunts have a worse prognosis compared to post-tricuspid shunts. We really don't have any Indian data on survival statistics, but it will be very interesting to do a large Indian registry to find out, because most of our patients are picked up young. They are in the 20s and 30s. It's very difficult to believe that their survival is going to be far less than what it is. Now coming to I've dealt with the 2 important aspects that you should know in the exams. A lot about hemodynamics, a basic understanding that is essential, and the essential about the natural history. So in natural history, it seems IPH, natural history survival, is equivalent to Eisenmenger syndrome, that is equivalent to CTD-PH. That is what is turning out. But examiners may not be aware of this, so you should know that mostly we felt that conventionally Eisenmenger syndrome had much better survival than IPH. That is what you should utter. And then say that if they ask you, then you should say that some of the recent studies are suggesting, mainly the REVEAL registry and the Eisenmenger syndrome major study of 1,100 patients, suggesting that the survival is as worse as the IPH groups. And that is because of tertiary care center bias, because of maybe they included older surviving patients, something like called immortal time bias. So this is the essential that you should know about the natural history. This will help you in discussing what are the possibilities after your case, after your history. What are the possibilities? Why these possibilities? Why you keep Eisenmenger syndrome ahead of IPH, and all those things you can answer very easily if you understand these basics. And I would recommend two important, I already told you, two important studies to read everybody is REVEAL registry results and the large circulation paper of Eisenmenger syndrome of 1100 patients. Now we come to the real काम की बात. That is the clinical approach to PH. So we are what are the signs that we have in PH which will be dealing with this thing. So a common question that is asked is, what causes dyspnea in IPH? What is the cause of dyspnea? So oftentimes we are always looking at, cardiologists have a focus on the ask question is that increased PVH causes dyspnea. We have fixed concepts. When it comes to right heart disease, for example, PS also has dyspnea. So dyspnea is not just about some cardiac pressures. It's a complex thing which has an afference, a lot of psychological and emotional inputs are there, and there are clear afferents from muscle, chemoreceptors, and pulmonary receptors, and there are respiratory mechanics and ventilation. Some of the things that you should know is the work of breathing, the feeling of chest constriction and tightness, and air hunger cannot get enough, and there is a role of J receptors, and there is a role of fixed cardiac output. There is a role of high pressures with increased work of breathing. These are some of the important causes of dyspnea, with I think maybe not in the right order, but I think increased work of breathing is a very, very important reason why patients become dyspnea. And low cardiac output or fixed cardiac output are some of the things that you should utter. But you should definitely read not only for this topic, but for other topic, a very beautiful chapter on Harrison that is giving, and even Braunwald giving the mechanism of dyspnea. That is a must. Everybody before appearing for exam, they should read. As I told you, like what are the different functional classes that you can have? There are various different classes that are listed. You should know something about it. But WHO functional class for PH, you should all know. So what causes angina? What causes syncope? So RV, ischemia. What causes syncope? Fixed cardiac output. So what causes hemoptysis in various diseases? So what is the cause? So we did a very nice study. Now we find that at least 1/4 of them actually bleed because of an aortopulmonary collateral. And there could be thrombosis in them because of in situ thrombosis can happen. It could be chronic thromboembolic PH producing by hemoptysis. Hemoptysis is well known to occur in Eisenmenger syndrome. And there are various causes, multiple causes can be there. And even bendopnea has been reported in IPH, and orthopnea has been reported in them. So moving on to the clinical signs of PH. So congestive heart failure will be there. Roughly around 20 to 25 patients in most of the important registries from our parts of the country. So hepatojugular reflex could be there. JVP will be elevated. Predominantly, AV will be there. If there is a gross TR, then you have a CVV will be prominent. There could be pulsatile liver if there is a high pressure TR, and then there can be pedal edema and ascites can be there. And there can be a low output state, which is a very common feature that can be there. And cyanosis is very important. If you are considering a patient who is not decompensated, who is not class 4, then you can consider them for an exercise and then do a pulse oximetry pre and post exercise. Or you can document a 6-minute walk distance if that is possible. So that is also is a very essential thing in assessment of PH. So coming to the real, the other cardiovascular examination. So apical impulse generally will be, there will be cardiomegaly in patients who are decompensated, generally kept in the exam, there will be cardiomegaly, and there will be mostly RV type of apex. If there is a PH is because of a hyperkinetic PH, because of a high flow situation, like in a VSD, large VSD producing PH, there can be LV type of apex, very rarely, mostly in children that you can find that. Or if it's a left heart disease producing PH, you can have a left LV type of apex. The cardiomegaly among the conditions that cause PH, you can find it in IPH with RV dysfunction, CTPH with RV dysfunction. Among the Eisenmenger syndrome, you don't find cardiomegaly in VSD Eisenmenger syndrome and PDA with Eisenmenger syndrome. You find cardiomegaly only in ASD with Eisenmenger syndrome. So if you find cardiomegaly, you can't have VSD Eisenmenger syndrome by and large, or you can't have PD Eisenmenger syndrome among the common causes that of evaluation. Parasternal heave. Again, BSD Eisenmenger syndrome, there won't be no prominent parasternal heave because there is a large BSD that is decompressing the RV. The RV pressure overload will be mostly there with a 3/3 heave or a 2/3 heave at least. And then RV volume overload also you can assess, but generally not preferred by most of the examiners. You say RV pressure overload or volume overload. You can limit if it is a real pressure overload. Limit. One of the most important signs that nobody in the examination should miss is a palpable P2. It's a very simple sign. It's absolutely nothing sign. So it's a very important sign that gives you a lot of clue. Then palpable P2 in the pulmonary area is a must. You must not miss this because that gives you a lot of information. I will be coming to that. So then you have a palpable S3 or S4. You know that S3 are more palpable than auscultable. And another important thing that you should always try to palpate is the palpable pulmonary artery pulsation. Oftentimes you find in patients with PAH, you can find both of them. The palpable P2 will be there along with the palpable pulmonary artery pulsation. You must auscultate the periphery, especially the axilla and the back for continuous murmurs for various reasons, mostly peripheral PS and sometimes AP collaterals. And there can be pleural effusion because finding a pleural effusion or pericardial effusion is generally a poor prognostic sign across various registries. Now, the most important question is a loud P2. How do you assess severity of PH? So how do you say P2 is loud? That's an invariable question that you just cannot. Whenever you say P2 is loud, immediately the examiner will pounce upon you, say, how do you say P2 is loud? So obviously, you have to compare with A2. That is a conventional thing. Then, if it is palpable, it is invariably loud. And another important thing is, it is heard at the apex. Where exactly? Generally, P2 is limited to the pulmonary area. It is not heard at the apex. If you are able to hear it at the apex, then it is almost always loud. Which situation you can confuse a palpable P2 in the pulmonary area? You have a palpable sound in the pulmonary area and you have a palpable pulsation in the pulmonary area. There is only one situation which you can confuse. If you find a palpable P2, with the exception of some diseases, it is always means PH. What are those exceptions? One exception, important exception is ASD, atrial septal defect. Palpable P2 in ASD does not mean PH. So just the presence of large flow, dilated pulmonary artery can give you a loud P2. So loud P2 also does not indicate PH in ASD. Hence, palpable P2 also does not indicate PH in ASD, number one. Another unrelated condition where you can make a big mistake and get stumped will be you get a palpable P2 in the pulmonary area and you have a pulsation there. It could be aorta. In which situation? When you have a L post aorta. In a complex case, if you find a palpable sound in the pulmonary area, invariably means PH, with the exception of ASD and CTGA. If you find a L post aorta, you can find a aortic sound that is palpable, A2 that is palpable there, and you can have an aorta, an L post left and anterior aorta, which can be palpated in the same pulmonary area. So you should always remember these two exceptions to this rule. So unconcentrated signs of PH will be RVS3 and S4 will be there. There is an ejection click, which is a constant ejection click will be there. A murmur of TR, and there's an ejection systolic murmur at the pulmonary area, and there's a early diastolic murmur of PR will be there. These are something that you should know. So this is what I was referring to. There is one nice study that is published, which suggests that the PA pressures are varying if where exactly P2 is heard. As you go down, if it is heard till the apex, the PA pressures are generally above 75 mm of Hg. This is a concept that you should understand. So this is one elegant, very rarely you find some clinical science-based studies. This is a very interesting study that actually looked at this. S2 more intense in the pulmonary area than in the aortic area, had 60% sensitivity and a specificity of 22%. Whereas A2 greater than P2 had 57% sensitivity and 39% specificity. And P2 in the mitral area, it was highly sensitive and specific. It is 68% and 41%. Whereas if you are all present everywhere, then all the signs are there. So 50 and 56. So this is a very interesting thing just to keep your, these are the major things that we are looking at. So So commonly, even if you have valve case also, you are often asked what is the severity of PVH and what is the severity of PH, even though we have been dealing with it in very many classes. But even in a valve case also, you are supposed to assess the severity of PVH and PH. So how do you assess it? Very simple. PVH assessment is based on clinical symptomatology and cardiomegaly and the course of orthopnea. Orthopnea is generally considered severe PVH. So these are the ways in which you assess. It's a subjective assessment. One more way you should assess is based on the back pressure changes in pH. For example, somebody has got a severe pH because of a mitral stenosis or mitral regurgitation. Then the PVH has to be at least moderate or severe. Without that, this amount of pH would not have happened. So you cannot say that mild PVH, in a mitral stenosis case, mild PVH and severe pH. That is not possible. So this has to be a severe PVH and severe pH, even though patient is only functional class 2. So that is how you assess PVH. But coming to pH severity, what is moderate severe pH? How do you assess? I will deal with ASD separately. In the absence of ASD, first and foremost thing is a palpable P2 in the pulmonary area. Palpable P2 in the pulmonary area is definite severe pH, unless proved otherwise. Then you have P2, which is louder than A2. That is a definite sign that this is a at least moderate to severe pH is there. Then if it is heard at the apex, P2 is well heard at the apex, then this is severe pH. Then you have to rely on the left parasternal heave. How much is the left parasternal heave? And then if you have TR, if it is normotensive TR or a low pressure TR or a high pressure TR, that also will tell you. Another important thing is really the pulmonary venous pressures can be found. Two diseases in which pulmonary venous can be estimated. Pulmonary vein pressures can be estimated will be ASD and CCP, because their LA pressure will be equivalent to RA pressure, which RA pressure will be transmitted to JVP. So from based on that also you can assess JVP. And this is a very classic slide you must have seen everywhere. So this is how do you differentiate between low pressure TR and a high pressure TR. The murmur will be pan-systolic murmur. This will be a very early systolic murmur with variable duration. The pitch of the murmur will generally, pitch is mostly determined by the gradient. So high pressure TR will have a high pitch, whereas low pressure TR will have a low pitch. The shape will be a pan-systolic murmur throughout thing. This will be a decrescent murmur, and you will have a P2 will be loud, and you have a JVP will have a CV wave, or it can be variable. So how do you differentiate between a low pressure and a high pressure PR? Again, the pitch will be high pressure in high pressure PR. Low pressure will be low. It will be, duration will be longer. It will be a brief decrescent, almost like an AR murmur you will find, which is slightly superficial AR murmur you will find. Loud and narrow P2 will be there, and soft and variable will be there. There will be palpable P2 and no palpable P2. A prominent PR generally in a situation of IPH suggests that in a situation of PH generally suggests PDA PH is very likely possibility. So in nutshell, the various features that will suggest a moderate to severe PHR, holosystolic murmur that increases with inspiration, increased jugular V waves, pulsatile liver, diastolic murmur, and a hepatojugular reflex. Whereas advanced PH with right ventricular failure will have, in addition, will have peripheral edema, hepatomegaly, distension of jugular vein, and an RBS3, and a low pressures will be there. Coming to the next part of clinical examination. Now we need to identify the etiology. Now we have assessed pH is there or not. Now we have assessed what is the severity of pH. Now we go on to the physical sign that will tell you the etiology. If the patient is cyanosed, generally means in cardiology examination, generally means it is likely to be Eisenmenger syndrome. Or rarely, very rarely, IPH can have a PFO and that is producing cyanosis. Or there is a shunt lesion which is small, but this is out of proportion pH that could be there. So generally, clubbing also suggests the same. But in practice, you have to think of other things like abnormal VQ mismatch, intrapulmonary shunts, like pulmonary AV malformations also. All those things you should think of. So then you have auscultatory findings you have to think of. If you have a rails and pulmonary effusion, then you have to think of left-sided diseases. Pulmonary parenchymal diseases also could be contributing. Then other things that you should think of are listed here. But by and large, you have to look for bruise and then portal pulmonary hypertension, very rarely kept in the exam. Then you have to look at the portal venous system signs. coming specifically to the signs that are found in different types of congenital heart disease in PH. So before that, there is a separate classification of shunt lesions with PH. There are 4 different classes that you should know. One is a classic Eisenmenger syndrome, where there is a large defect, there is a severe increase in PVR, and there is a reverse shunt. And then you have PH associated with systemic to pulmonary shunt. They are moderate defect with no cyanosis at rest, but they can have not Eisenmenger syndrome. It's not right to left again. And then you have disproportionate PH. That means PH with small defects. So then you have PH after corrective surgery. So PH has been wrongly, the patient has been corrected wrongly, and then that is now persistent PH. These are the 4 classes of congenital heart disease with PH that you should be aware of. So coming to VSD with PH, how do you differentiate? A small VSD will produce a loud murmur, Maladie-de-Roger disease, Maladie-de-Roger. That could be a prominent split with increasing flow. There will be a prominent split. That can be an LV apex. That can be cardiomegaly with the flow that is increasing with a moderate defect. Then you have a large defect, means there is no murmur, hardly any murmur. There is a very short systolic murmur can be there. And once you have a markedly elevated pulmonary artery pressure, no flow, no murmur is produced at the VSD side. You can have a small, short ejection systolic murmur in the pulmonary area, and the S2 becomes single. So initially S2 will be normal, loud murmur will be there. As pH goes on increasing, the murmur goes down, the split becomes wider if increased flow, but then flow diminishes, almost develops Eisenmenger syndrome, the S2 becomes single. So that is what you should remember. The same thing happens in PDA with PH. As the pH increases in a PDA situation, the murmur becomes, start eaten from the right side. That means diastolic murmurs come down. Only systolic flow murmurs are heard in the PDA side. And then after that, no murmur can be heard in PDA also. There is no murmur in PDA. When there is a large PDA with severe pH, almost like an Eisenmenger syndrome, you can't find any murmur. So the most interesting and the toughest one to understand the pH is with ASD. So ASD in clinical features in adults, signs may be masked. AF can be presenting features. There can be PH, there can be moderate TR, heart failure with advancing age, hypertension, and AF. So the key critical question is, how do you assess pH in ASD? P2 loud? No. ASD alone can have a P2 loud. P2 palpable? Rarely in the young patients, P2 can be still palpable because loudness is not an indicator. Then left parasternal heave, ASD produces large volume overload, can have 3/3 parasternal heave without pH. So then how do you diagnose pH in ASD? This is not a very simple, straightforward thing. If patient has cyanosis and there's a loud P2, then obviously patient has cyanosis clearly means most likely reversal of shunt if there is no other causes found. In the absence of cyanosis, how do you diagnose pH in ASD? You find a large heart. You think that there's a large flow, but you don't find RVS3 or you don't find a flow murmur across the ejection systolic murmur across the pulmonary area. You start suspecting pH. You understand what I'm saying? ASD, cardiomegaly is there, large heart is there, large amount of symptoms are there in the absence of cyanosis. If there is cyanosis, it's simple and easy. In the absence of cyanosis, you should start thinking in terms of pH. You find a large heart, you find a large symptomatic patient, but you don't find a flow murmur because the flow is not there. With severe pH, the increased flow, QP by QS, is coming down to 1:1 from nearly 2:1, 3:1. So if there is a 2:1, 3:1, you will find a large murmur, a prominent murmur in the pulmonary area, and you will find an S3 in the tricuspid area. The RVS3 will be there. But if you are not finding them in the presence of a large heart in a symptomatic patient, you should start suspecting pH. Another important question in congenital heart disease is whether it is an Eisenmenger type of pH or is it a hyperkinetic pH, meaning that pH is severe, but whether the patient is operable or inoperable. That is a clinical question in this. So clinical question answer should be a large heart generally means an VSD. A large heart, this is regarding to VSD mostly. So large heart hyperkinetic pH means generally operable. The impulse will be a LV type of apical impulse with a hyperkinetic thing, where it obstruction with no cardiomegaly will be there in Eisenmenger syndrome, and the impulse will be maybe silent or forceful. The click is absent, click can be there. So P2 will be wide and fixed in both of them if it is ASD. VSD will be wide and variable. If it's a large flow is still there, whereas it becomes single, as I told you in the previous slides. And PDA can be initially paradoxical split, becomes normal split. And then shunt murmurs, because flow murmurs and shunt murmurs may be present if it's a hyperkinetic situation where they become absent, no flow murmur will be there. The respective flow murmurs will all disappear in an Eisenmenger syndrome. So a lot of things has gone in, so now we need to answer this. At what age a large VSD will Eisenmengerize? This is a conceptual question, because most of your, I think, mind may, if you have asked about Eisenmenger syndrome, immediately the first chapter that opens is Fallwood series. And most of you will tell, I know that answer that I always get in the exam is, people will say 10 years or 20 years, because that is the average age at which Fallwood series is presented. We are asking when patient will Eisenmengerize. They start to Eisenmengerize by nearly 2 years. A large VSD, a large proportion of large VSD will be inoperable by 2 years of age. Even though they may not have reversed or they may not have become absolutely Eisenmengerization, the one key in the understanding thing that you should all understand is Eisenmengerization is not a one-point event. It is not operable or inoperable. It is a process that keeps on happening. The pulmonary reactive changes keeps on progressing. Pulmonary artery proliferative changes keeps on happening. The reactive pH component keeps on increasing. So this is a process that starts as early as 6 months, and it is generally complete by 2 years. So anybody who find a large VSD with severe pH should be operated then and there beyond 6 weeks of life. That is the message that I'm trying to convey. So this is a classic example. The same patient, this is Dr. Kothari's patient, one of the patients, so who was seen like with this X-ray, and after 1 year was seen with this X-ray, and he believed a few years later was seen with this X-ray. So most common base-link lesion for an Eisenmenger syndrome are the ventricular septal defect. These are some of the Indian data that we have, and almost ventricular septal defects are the predominant one. As I told you, most of our patients are generally relatively okay, roughly around 400 plus, which predominantly class 2 patients. So that is something that we don't know the outcomes in our patients compared to most of the Western countries where patients are on follow-up for quite some time, where the prognosis may be still worse. But our prognosis, maybe in my experience, will be maybe what we conventionally think that it is better than IPH still may hold true. So I've done a lot of lecturing, so let us answer this question. Which one of the following clinical sign is unlikely in a VSD Eisenmenger uncomplicated patient? Single S2, palpable second sound, cardiomegaly, absent parasternal heave. So the answer is they don't have cardiomegaly. So cardiomegaly in Eisenmenger syndrome is generally found in ASD Eisenmenger syndrome only. So in general, Eisenmenger syndrome are generally cyanosis is mild. There is absence of cardiomegaly or heart failure, and there's a minimal left parasternal lift will be there. Absence of significant shunt murmur, flow murmurs will be there. Signs of pH predominate, that's a constant ejection click of pH will be there, and pulmonary regurgitation murmur may be audible. This is a very important slide that you should know. pH. Usual age of Eisenmenger syndrome is less than 2 years. I'm not talking about presentation, but generally 20 to 40 years in ASD. Very rarely until ASD Eisenmengers we have seen, but we don't know whether they are really Eisenmenger or they are IPH superimposed on simple uncomplicated ASDs. Differential cyanosis is an important sign that clinches the diagnosis of PDA. Cardiomegaly is only found in ASD unless you have some other cause like ventricular dysfunction or something late stages where you can find it in VSD and PDA. P2 is generally single in VSD. It is narrow or normal. It remains wide and fixed. Some of you say that it becomes narrower, but then we would not have auscultated before. Obviously, a patient of ASD, when they become Eisenmengerized, the split would have narrower than before. But then generally, we don't have the documentation. Still, it remains wide and fixed. So we don't have clinical signs of heart failure except in ASD. And parasternal heave is not found in VSD and PDA generally, and ASD it is found. TR murmur is more common in ASD, and PDA murmur is more common in PR murmur is more common in PDA PH. So these are the rough guides that all of you should know in the exam. This is a very important slide that all of you should be totally aware of. Whereas common age of presentation of Eisenmenger syndrome will be roughly around 2nd decade and 4th decade for ASD. So once you have an Eisenmenger syndrome problem, then generally the confusion is not with IPH and Eisenmenger syndrome. Mostly it is a confusion between tetralogy and Eisenmenger syndrome. How do you differentiate? Eisenmenger syndrome, we know the natural force, 3 types of presentation: cyanosis, continuing cyanosis, cyanosis increased QP. The common garden BSD Eisenmengers and SD Eisenmenger can present to you with 2 types. One is increased flow symptoms, heart failure in infancy, settled phase, and coming to you with insidiously at around 20 years, classical presentation of Eisenmenger, and there can be an insidious presentation of Eisenmenger syndrome. But the most important historical differentiation is early onset of cyanosis in TOF, spells, and squatting, which we all know. And these are the various differences that can be there, which I think has been dealt with in various other classes. So I won't be going into the details of this. But then, by and large, at times it can become very, very difficult to differentiate. But generally, understanding the natural history, understanding the clinical science, but loud P2 and a palpable P2 definitely clinches the diagnosis of PH in most of these patients, unless you are confusing it with the CTJ VSD PS. So it is. Can I keep the X-ray and all for next class, or should I continue?
Yeah, that will be great, sir. It's a fantastic clinical approach that you have given today. And it will be fine that if we have X-ray, ECG, and the cath basics for a case of a PH in the next class, step by step. So if you are okay with that, what do you think?
I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it because I already come to around 7 now. So I thought some of the concepts I want to drive it in, so I was slightly slower.
This is fantastic. Sumodh and Girish and Neeraj, you can join us in the discussion. So it's a very practical, simplified, and a very wonderful approach, sir. That you have given a practical approach to a case of PH. My question to you is, just before we go ahead, so that the initial hemodynamic slide that you had shown, there were 2 slides in which the first one was based on transpulmonary gradient, after which the diastolic pulmonary gradient was being measured. And the other one, the next one, which showed didn't mention the transpulmonary gradient, which probably was a newer one, which used only diastolic pulmonary gradient.
Yeah. So now the field has moved into more into diastolic pulmonary gradient.
So for theoretical purposes, exam, the resident should be aware of both, and practically the latest one is uses of only the diastolic pulmonary gradient, right?
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah. Right. Absolutely right. The cutoffs are cutoff. They should know 12 and 15. We'll accept most of them, and 5 and 7, like 5 and 7.
Yeah, 7. Sumodh, Girish, and Dr. Neeraj, with questions and comments from your side.
I don't have any questions here in the chat box, and it was a wonderful presentation as always, Dr. Rama. Just for exam-oriented, few questions which the common scenario we are the candidate is presenting an ASD case, and the question asked is this ASD an innocent bystander? What do you think? Or is it a ASD Eisenmenger? So are there examination findings or history which can help to answer this question, whether is the ASD an innocent bystander or is this a ASD PH situation?
So, like, you want to differentiate between the ASD Eisenmenger and IPH with an ASD?
IPH and ASD.
ASD or a PFO?
ASD, IPH or ASD Eisenmengerization?
So, I think practically, the only key important differentiation will be the history, whether they had a history of history where it started. And then practically point-wise, I think it may be very difficult to differentiate. Like,
yeah, absolutely, sir. I agree. Probably we want to hear when the natural history, as you have shown, is very important.
Wide and fixed splitting will be something that if it is there, then you can be slightly assured.
Absolutely, sir.
But otherwise, you can be absolutely sure about this. Like, because cardiomegaly can happen in IPH also with RV dysfunction.
Yeah, absolutely. So clinical features may be same. The history is very important. But because by natural history, we know that Eisenmengerization is in the third or fourth decade, particularly in classical ASDs. So one should always suspect the IPH whenever examining a new patient. Just for the
wide and fixed splitting, if it is classically there, then you can convincingly say that possibly it is a. That is the only.
And, many times the examination findings are of a pan-systolic murmur in a case of ASD or an Eisenmengerization situation. So how do examiner defend a pan-systolic murmur in a case of Eisenmengerization situation?
So generally it has to be, you have to defend it like a TR murmur. Like, There is I can't think of any other explanation if you're thinking in terms of an Eisenmenger syndrome. So it has to be a TR murmur, and then you have to look for CV waves in JVP and a pulsatile liver. If they are there, then it has to be a TR. And generally, you find TR most often in ASD Eisenmenger syndrome, but it can be there in. We have seen a few in VSD also.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know that there is only AV valve regurgitation and a VSD which can cause a pansystolic murmur. VSD in a PH situation will never cause a PH, so it has to be a AV valve regurgitation. So this is something common which we
unless
found
you
in
find
exam.
a pansystolic murmur in the pulmonary area, which could be just a PDA with severe PH.
Yes. Sir, one common question which the students are asking is why does the split remains wide and split even after Eisenmengerization?
So that is because of the compliance. It's about compliance, like on the hangout interval. It never normalizes. Like whatever reasons produces the wideness of sound remains so even after development of the Eisenmenger syndrome. Like for example, even after surgery, also oftentimes you don't find. Not oftentimes. Sometimes you can.
Usually, yes.
You don't find wide and fixed split disappearing.
There is a general thought right from the beginning that ASD may not Eisenmengerize. It's all case of PPH that we are detecting. So, what is the current understanding about that? Does ASD Eisenmengerize or all these are PPH superimposed on ASD? Because
clinically also, like you find two types of, I think we all must have seen enough of patients now. I think most of the patients who present early, like for example, early infancy ASDs with a PH are the typical that 18, 20-year-old girls with coming with severe PH with ASD. The course is terrible. Generally, they are very progressive. And you almost clinically feel that as a good observer, you feel that they are more likely IPH. And the incidence is also almost, there is a paper from CMC Vellore which discussed the incidence of such PH with ASD complicating in younger age group is similar to the incidence of IPH in the what they have observed. So I think mostly they are all IPH mostly, but typically that 40, 50-year-old who coming to with recent onset cyanosis, then there is clearly there is a Eisenmenger syndrome, and there is a gray area in between which we can't be sure. Sir, being aortopulmonary collateral being an important cause of hemoptysis in Eisenmenger, do you routinely retrace all patients with Eisenmenger presenting with hemoptysis or only if recurrent hemoptysis occurs? We generally do, by and large, whenever we are diagnosing quickly, like for example, late presenters we are doing, if the echo videos are not good, generally we have a routine of getting some anatomical confirmation, because we should not miss some peripheral PS or something like it, even though they happen once in a while. But generally we do a CT angio as a baseline. So if the windows are not good, so there also we note it down specifically whether there is epicollaterals are there or not, whether they have a hemoptysis or not. But generally we reserve it for recurrent hemoptysis. We don't do it at, or if it is a massive or a large moderate amount of hemoptysis, generally we get it done immediately. Admit the patient, whenever who needs a hemoptysis, needs a blood transfusion or an admission, we generally get a CT angio done. Or if the patient has recurrent hemoptysis, we get it done on OPD basis. The clinching thing about diagnosis of Eisenmenger, we said is loud P2, palpable P2. And now the whole question is that, VSD Eisenmenger versus VSD pulmonary atresia, it could be a loud aortic sound, maybe palpable, because there is no PA. And now how to differentiate whether it's A2, whether it's P2. The aortic sound could be very well be held in mitral area. Now how to, the cyanosis could be, there for a long time. Now how to... Even though it's a good question, it's a great question. Like oftentimes, most of the examiners will not agree if you keep a differential diagnosis of VSD pulmonary atresia and VSD Eisenmenger syndrome. So some of the examiners, especially the adult examiners, will really get wild. Like I've seen a few examiners getting really wild, but really in practice, at times it can become really difficult to differentiate. But if you apply all the principles of how the things started, how things progressed, and what are the clinical signs, and then you look at the dilated PA sign is there, and then there's a palpable P2 is there. Generally, if it is palpable P2 is there in the pulmonary area, only other could be CTGA pulmonary atresia. If you are finding a palpable P2 in the pulmonary area, this has to be pH underscored. Otherwise aortic sound cannot be there, palpable there. Aortic sound
Yeah,
should be
as
palpable in
only
the aortic area.
aorta could be dilated.
Aorta could be
Dilating the
dilated,
aorta.
but
No,
then generally you find it both. Then it will be palpable both. So you have to put your things. You have to look for murmurs. Then generally, most importantly, a 20-year-old with pulmonary atresia will be deeply blue, whereas a Eisenmenger syndrome for 20 years will not be deeply blue. That will be the most important thing. Like tetralogy, at times, I think I've done enough of adult congenital work, but at times my initial diagnosis also becomes wrong. At times I label in the OPD from the OPD before echo. At times my echo diagnosis can be wrong, because at times you can confuse with the tetralogy. But once you put everything together, then 90% of the time you should be able to come to a diagnosis, and you don't have to keep both the physiologists differential diagnosis.
Dr. Rama has been repeatedly emphasizing the need of proper history. And of course, the presence of any continuous murmur, if it is there. Continuous murmur tells you that there is a continuous difference between systole and diastole across the pulmonary vascular bed from the systemic circulation, which is never possible in a case of severe PH situation. So any continuous murmur, or as a matter of fact, if you are getting a very good ejection systolic murmur, these 2 pointers are strongly against a severe pulmonary artery hypertension, because they tell you a significant gradient between the two chambers. But yes, as Dr. Rama is saying, that we have to be very a good history would elicit many of the things. So there are certain questions which have been raised in the chat box. So one is Dr. Kamlesh from Pondicherry is asking us, dyspnea and fixed cardiac output kindly correlate.
So any low cardiac output can present with dyspnea, that we all know. Like there is a various ways, muscle gets less blood, muscle sends signals, a lot of things, respiratory muscle fatigue, a lot of things are there. Any low cardiac output can present with dyspnea. So whenever exercise induce failure to increase low cardiac output, definitely will produce dyspnea. It's as simple as that.
Sir, is there a non-invasive way of measuring the diastolic pulmonary gradient? That is one of the questions which has been asked.
There were attempts to some echo parameters have been developed, but I don't think they have become standardized. Like they are not standard. Like there is an attempt to measure. There's a very big problem because we are dealing within the low range. So I think a lot of problems are there in that estimation.
Another question which is there is, why S2 is single in VSD Eisenmenger and variable in PD Eisenmenger?
So S2 has to be single because in VSD Eisenmenger, because there's a large hole, both the ventricles are pumping together. So S2 has to be single there. Whereas in PDA, it is not exactly the same. And in vast majority of real PDA Eisenmenger, it can be really narrow, or you cannot make out. It can be single also there. So, but still the aorta and P are totally different things. Like aortic valve, we are looking at aortic valve and pulmonary valve. So aortic valve and pulmonary valve should work together because there is a large VSD is there. Whereas here the connection is later, and then they can work differently.
What is the mechanism of PR, sir, in PDA Eisenmenger?
PDA Eisenmenger is there are most likely it will be dilatation of PA happening from a very early age. Because if you look at the dilatation alone, dilatation may be more severe in ASD.
Yeah.
But it starts at a very early age, younger age, possibly it gives way slightly earlier. I don't know. That's a great question. I really don't. That's what I can think of. Any other panelists can answer if they know anything better than this.
So
that is the reason, sir, because of dilatation of PA from very early age, that might be the reason.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Rama. Thank you so much again for a very fantastic, comprehensive, and a very clinically exam-based lecture. And you have dealt with the hemodynamics, given us a 3-point practical approach that how do you correlate with hemodynamics, the etiology, and a clinical approach to a case of PH with a focus on Eisenmengers. And simultaneously, you have stimulated residents and all of us to read many new articles, because Eisenmenger has traditionally been correlated only to the Paul Wood series. And as you very nicely highlighted, the Kempton series in circulation that has been published in 2016, and then certain new data. Before we end, could you please also suggest any good reads for our residents? Because I would strongly recommend that the session that has been taken today by Dr. Rama will be making it available within a couple of days. You must listen to it again, and please read a case of PH, the guidelines that have been given. And if you come prepared next time, your understanding about the case and the clinical approach, the ECG, X-ray, and the cath assessment would be much better. So would you give any good recommended reads besides the routine books that people are reading?
I think most important thing is the guidelines. Like the ESG guidelines are really fantastic. They really give you a good guide of how to practice the PH, and there is that is something that you all must read. Like before, because I may not be touching the management part. That is something that is the practical thing. That is something that they all should read. That's a must that everybody should read. How to really evaluate a patient, what investigations to be done, and what to be done. I'll be touching upon that. So that is something that really everybody should read, because even though exam there is too much of stress on X-ray and ECG, but in real life I don't think it's just a starter. Like in real life things start after your echo. So that is the paradox of our exam. So I think they should read that. I think that's a very important article they should read.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramakrishnan. Thank you, Sumodh. Thank you, Girish. And thank you, Dr. Neeraj, for joining us today. And sir, we will catch up next Thursday again, same time. And I request all of you to join. More than 200 people are today there with us. And many of you who have missed, we'll be posting this lecture. And in case of any questions, comments, and clarifications, please write to us, subscribe to the Delhi CSI channel on YouTube, and you can visit and download all the videos. Thank you, Intas, for providing us this nice platform. And we'll catch up next Thursday, same time, with the next webinar in this series. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.